Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Granville branch of the Kent District Library. This is the second presentation in a series that we've been doing with our good friends at KDL called Voices of Indigenous People for Community and Healing. I'm Michael Vendetta, and I'm the director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, and we've had just a great time over the last number of years partnering with KDL, bringing presentations that are both local and global in their understanding. It's a global series. And I'm glad to be part of this with my colleagues Rachel Brooks and Erica Kubik, and welcome all of you tonight. Our council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do that through a host of partners like KDL, but 50 corporate partners who do international business because they want their employees to be globally savvy, and 11 colleges and universities in northern and western Michigan who, of course, want their students to be the same. You can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. And we do say thanks to our friends at KDL, and I'd like to have Henny Vandrager came up and talk a little bit about what's going on at the library, and also some words about the land that we are on right now, right?
Yep. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I thought we could take a moment and center ourselves and think about the land that we are currently sitting on. Kent District Library acknowledges that we are situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, or Three Fires Confederacy, comprised of the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and Potawatomi tribes. While the Treaty of Chicago in 1821 sold most lands south of Grand Rapids, and the Treaty of Washington in 1836 sold most land north of the river, we acknowledge the vibrancy and continued presence of Native peoples living in our community. Kent District Library is committed to accurately representing our community and hopes that we may reflect on the ways history shapes the current issues we face together. Everyone who walks through the doors of our KDL branches should see themselves reflected in our collections, our services, and the programs, much like what we're offering tonight. Offering programs such as this event is part of that effort. We are committed to reflecting the richly diverse community we serve. I want to thank the World Affairs Council for partnering with us on this series. It was a work of love. I have to say it took a lot of time, and I have to say they work with a lot of thoughtfulness and sensitivity, especially around a subject like this. We also acknowledge that we come to this program with very different backgrounds and very different experiences. Because this series highlights the ongoing struggles of colonialism, the content is distressing. We invite you to reflect on the topic in a way that takes your own safety into consideration, as well as the safety of others in this audience. And with that, I'd like to offer the mic up to Michael again to introduce our speaker tonight.
Well, we are honored and delighted to have Heather Bruegl with us. She's a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and a first-line descendant of the Stockbridge Munsee. She's a graduate of Madonna University and holds a Bachelor's of Arts and Master's of Arts degrees from that university in U.S. history. Heather consults for various museums and universities and is a frequent lecturer at conferences on topics ranging from intergenerational racism and trauma to the fight for clean water in the Native community. She's been invited to share her research on Native American history, including policy and activism, museum equity, and land-back initiatives for institutions such as the Tate Museum and the Brooklyn Public Library. Heather opened and spoke at the Women's March anniversary in Lansing and the first ever Indigenous Peoples March in Washington, D.C. In 2019, 2020, and 2021, Heather spoke at the Crazy Horse Memorial and Museum in Custer, South Dakota, for its Talking Circle series. She's currently a doctoral student in her spare time at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, where she studies First Nations education, focusing on creative, inclusive, historical narratives for teaching. Heather is a public historian, activist, and independent consultant who works with institutions and organizations for Indigenous sovereignty and collective liberation. After her presentation this evening, there will be ample time for questions. Please exhibit civility to our guest and hospitality to others here by asking respectful and succinct questions. Her presentation is a difficult one tonight, and we're glad she's here to guide us with it. It's called She's Gone Missing, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. Let's welcome Heather Bruegl to West Michigan.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be back here in West Michigan. I lived in Granville for about a year, many years ago. And I liked it. It was fun, but I love being on the east side of the state. Currently live in downtown Detroit. But I grew up in the suburbs, but there's nothing like downtown Detroit. I'm sorry, Grand Rapids is great, but but Detroit is home, and that's the most amazing place in the world. So I'm really excited, surprisingly, just given the topic, to be able to talk to you guys tonight about this topic. And the reason I say excited is because it gives me the opportunity to bring awareness to an issue that you may not know about, right? It gives me the opportunity to say some names and to talk about some people who often get forgotten about, right? But it is important to note that tonight's topic, number one, I presented on the same topic last night, so I'm a little spent from it. But tonight's topic is hard and it's difficult. I will be discussing not only colonization and colonial violence, but domestic violence and sexual assault. So if you are triggered in any way, shape, or form, I want you to stand up and I want you to leave and I want you to take a moment, okay? Your mental health is way more important. If you are able to gather yourself and come back in, great. If you can't, that's okay too, okay? That's all right. And yeah, I will leave plenty, I think it's a historian thing, I ramble, but I'm going to try really hard to leave a lot of time for questions. And so hopefully we'll get to some of those and things like that. So I just wanted to start. We had a land acknowledgement, which is great. I love that. I also just wanted to acknowledge a lot of the other tribes in Michigan, though, too. So the Peoria, the Miami, the Wyandotte, and the Fox, they all called Detroit and Michigan home. So they were across the state. So I think that's really important. And I just want to highlight the ending. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present, and we understand that this acknowledgement is just a first step in the building of a more inclusive and equitable space for all, right? That's a call to action. It's a call to action. So land acknowledgements, we're acknowledging that we're on stolen land, we're acknowledging the ancestors and the people. We acknowledge where the tribes are currently located, Canada, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and other parts of Michigan. But I'm calling you to action, right? I'm calling you to do something, so that's really important. I was already graciously introduced, so thank you. But if you want to contact me in any way, shape, or form, there's my contact information up there. Again, my name is Heather. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I work as a historian and independent consultant. You can have my Gmail address if you don't abuse it. No abusing it. I do have a Twitter. I'm not really on it because Twitter is awful. I do have an Instagram, though, where you can see pictures of my dogs, who are really cute, and I love to bake, so occasionally I will make a pie from scratch and take a photo of it. And my website, which lets you know upcoming events. You can subscribe to my Substack, but you can also see like what I've been working on, what I'm doing. So, and it's also another way to get a hold of me. Again, trigger warning. Okay, we're going to talk about some pretty hard stuff. I also want to have this helpline up here. This is for culturally appropriate help, Strong Hearts Native Hotline, or helpline. This is the number 2 that I strongly encourage you to give out to people. Okay, if they need culturally sensitive and appropriate help, Strong Hearts Native Helpline is there for you. If you are a non-Native person and you call them, they may not be able to help you, but they're going to give you numbers that you can call to get help. So they don't leave anyone hanging, right? They don't leave anyone hanging. So, here we go. Okay. Who remembers Gabby Petito? Right? Everybody. You should remember Gabby Petito. So, in case you don't, in July of 2021, Gabby and her fiance Brian left New York on a cross-country trip. On August 12th, there was a disorderly conduct stop after someone spotted the couple and called the police. On August 25th, Gabby made her last post to Instagram. And their van they were traveling in was spotted in the Grand Teton National Park. A couple of days later, Gabby's mother reports getting suspicious text messages from her. On September 1st, Brian returns home to Florida, but he returns home without Gabby. On September 11th, 2021, Gabby is reported missing. On September 15th, Brian is named a person of interest. On September 19th, there are remains found, and it is later confirmed that they were Gabby's. On August 21st, the remains of Brian are found. This case is extremely tragic because it resulted in the loss of life. Actually, 2 lives. It resulted in the loss of life. Someone was missing, someone was harmed. It was awful. But from the time that Gabby was reported missing until the time that her remains were found was only 8 days. It was 8 days. That's like record time. Why? Why was it only 8 days from report to recovery? When Gabby went missing, it wasn't just that her family had lost her, right? She was all over your news. Whatever news you listened to, whether it was independent media or your usual Fox or NBC or ABC, on your social media, on your Twitter feed, on your Instagram feed, she was everywhere. Everyone felt like they lost Gabby, and everyone was looking for her. The whole nation felt it. Her name was absolutely everywhere. You couldn't turn anywhere without hearing about her. It's very sensitive tonight. Kimberly Iron is 21 when she left her home in Billings, Montana on September 22nd, 2020, leaving her 3 children behind with their grandparents in Hardin, Montana. On September 22nd, she contacted her father, Curtis Iron from Las Vegas, saying that she was upset and needed money to get home. She told him she was okay, but a parent knows their child, and he didn't believe her. He knew something was off. Each time he would try to call her back, the numbers that he had for her, you get that little disconnect dial tone. Kimberly last contacted her father, who lives on the Crow Reservation in Montana, on October 6, 2020. No one has seen her since. We all knew Gabby's name, but I can guarantee you nobody knows Kimberly's name. But you know her name tonight. So, I want to talk to you about something called missing white woman syndrome. And I want to preface this by saying, when anybody goes missing, it is important that we do everything in our power to try to find them. But this is a phrase that was coined because there's something underlying there. So if you're familiar with PBS NewsHour, one of the great journalists who was on there, Gwen Ifill, coined this term at a journalism conference in 2004. And basically what it means is it's a hunger for stories about victims who look a certain way at the exclusion of all other victims. They're young, they're white, they're blonde. They hold a certain weight. And this particular painting of a victim, young, white, female, blonde, holds symbolic weight in the American psyche. It's historical. When we think about missing white woman syndrome, it's not something that just happened out of a vacuum. It is historical. So I want you to think about, you're sitting in your history class, right? You're back in high school, middle school, whenever you learned about this, but I want you to think about the lost colony of Roanoke. So what does the lost colony of Roanoke have to do with missing and murdered Indigenous peoples? Well, it has to do quite a lot. So the first child to be born in the colonies was a young girl by the name of Virginia Dare. Now, when I was super, super young, we lived in North Carolina, and Roanoke's off the coast of the Outer Banks in North Carolina. I was in elementary school. And so we had North Carolina history, and let me tell you, everybody is obsessed with the lost colony of Roanoke. Myself included. I am determined that I am going to find out what happened to them. No, I'm not. I watched a documentary a couple weeks ago, and it said new evidence about what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke. And it was in this documentary where they talk about the birth of Virginia Dare. Now, she's the first young person to be born in quote, the New World, in the colonies. And she disappears, right? Because the whole colony disappears. But everybody's obsessed with what happened to Virginia Dare. So much so that in the area where the colony went missing, she was like a toddler, but there is like a life-size statue of what she would look like as an adult. And people go there and almost worship at it. And they want to know what happened to Virginia. I just came here to talk to her. I want to know what happened to her. It's so sad, it's so tragic. Now I want you to think a few years forward. And I want you to think about a young girl named Pocahontas. Okay? Everybody remembers Pocahontas, right? When you learn about her in your textbooks, she's 10 years old. She's a child. She's a little girl. She is, but you would never know that she was 10 by the way that she's portrayed in popular culture. And when you hear about John Smith at this same time, he'd be 27. That is gross. 10 years old and 27. But what happens from that, right? There's this myth of an alleged relationship. He never mentions an alleged relationship when he gives his accounts back to the crown in England. There's no defiance on Pocahontas' part to bring John Smith and the other colonists food. In fact, Chief Powhatan said, hey, those colonists are going to starve if we don't help them. We should bring them food. She didn't defy anyone. She didn't throw herself upon his body and save his life. She didn't run out to warn that there was something that was going to happen. That was all embellished. John made it up. He made it all up. Why? Because it makes it sound more interesting, and it provides this myth. And you know what? He was never questioned. He was never questioned about an alleged relationship with a 10-year-old child who was later captured by the British and held on a ship for over a year. Right? But we don't talk about that. We don't talk about Pocahontas in the same way we would talk about Virginia Dare. There's something different. When you think about popular culture in more modern history, and even though it is 2023, the 1920s would still be on the cusp of modern history. If you're familiar with the film Birth of a Nation, it's an old black and white film. It's a huge film. It gave rise to the Ku Klux Klan. It was a film that was premiered at the White House. Woodrow Wilson had a screening of it. And in that film, white women are portrayed as the victims, when more often than not, it was black women who were the victims at the hands of white men, and white women too. So missing white women syndrome is historical, as they have always been seen as victims. And I want you to think back to the day that Gabby's remains were found. I did. Hello. Okay, I want you to think back to the day that Gabby's remains were found. In that same area, between 2011 and 2020, 710 Indigenous women were reported missing from that same area. 710. Now, I'm going to say, in the Indian way, we're all related. So these are my sisters, these are my aunties, these are my grandmothers. 710 in the same spot that Gabby was found. So that's just something to think about. We're going to go over some statistics. There's not a lot, because no federal agency has actual concrete statistics on how many Indigenous women are missing and or murdered. So the statistics that we have come from independently run Indigenous nonprofits who go out there and do the work. So the first set of statistics that we have, more than 4 in 5 Native women have experienced violence. 4 in 5. More than 1 in 2 have experienced sexual violence. Alaskan Native women experience violence, a rate of sexual assault and higher rates of domestic violence than any other Indigenous group. Why? Because they're so remote. Our Alaskan brothers and sisters live in such remote villages that it's hard to get to them. On some reservations, women are murdered at a rate that is 10 times higher than the national average. Many times, the assailant is a non-Native person. It's about 70 to 80% of the time the assailant is non-Native. There are no firm statistics on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the lack of response is alarming, to say the least. That's like an understatement. There's a lack of law enforcement, not on the side of tribal police, but on the federal side, and we'll talk about jurisdiction in a little bit. Many times these crimes don't even get investigated at the federal level. Between 2005 and 2009, U.S. attorneys declined to prosecute 67% of Indian country matters that involved sexual abuse or related matters. They just flat out declined to prosecute them. 67%. That is an awful lot. That is an awful lot, and that's not acceptable. So why is this an issue, and what is society's role? And I apologize for the darkness of that title. That is an accessibility issue. So the title of it is Why is this an issue, and what is society's role for those who have issues with vision? So society treats white women as human beings. The way missing Indigenous women are reported in the media is drastically different from the way a white woman is portrayed. So when we talk about crimes committed against Black and brown women, there's a tone of victim blaming. Not that it doesn't happen to white women, because it absolutely does. It absolutely does. But it seems, through studies, through the Urban Indian Health Institute, it seems to happen to Indigenous women at a rate that's much higher than it does to any other group. Well, she shouldn't have been wearing that. What was she doing going to the casino so late? She was drunk. She had to come in, right? That's victim blaming. That's blaming the victim for the atrocities that have happened to her. Many times, because of jurisdictional challenges, the disappearances can be hard to track and prosecute. In Indian country, it's interesting because we have a number of ways that jurisdiction is handled. You have tribal police, you have 6 states that are PL 280 states, public law 280 states, where the state has some jurisdiction, but other than that, we're at the mercy of federal jurisdiction, and that includes the FBI and the Bureau of Indian Affairs Police. So when there's a crime committed in Indian country that is also a federal crime, so like murder, right? You don't call in the state police, you call in the federal police. And sometimes that can take days to happen. And there have been many times where the victim, if he or she is a citizen of a tribal nation, there are a lot of logistical questions that are asked before an investigation is even started. So where was she a citizen of? Where was her body found? Who do we suspect she was out with? There have been plenty of times where authorities have come in and measured with a literal tape measure to make sure that they're within jurisdiction, right? Because you can't step outside of that. So it's really important, and one of the main reasons a lot of these crimes don't get talked about is because of those jurisdictional issues. But this isn't a problem that just happens here in the United States. Canada has been looking into this issue for a number of years now. In a preliminary study, well, I don't think it's preliminary anymore, but in a study that they did in 2012, they found that Indigenous women in Canada make up 4% of the female population, 4%, okay? But in 2012, they made up 25% of the female homicide victim rate. 25%, that's a lot. There are calls for better handling of the notification process of missing and murdered Indigenous women. If you were a citizen of another country and you went missing in the United States would notify that country. We'd let you know, or that other country would notify us. But that doesn't happen in Indian country. We don't get the same respect. If one of ours goes missing off reservation, we don't hear about it. We're not. So it gives this false sense of sovereignty. And in the area where Gabby was found, only 18% of murdered Indigenous women ever got media attention, where 51% of white women did. So we don't make the national news. We don't make news outside of Indian country, right? There have been more shows and documentaries that are coming into the mainstream, but other than that, we don't make it outside of Indian country, which is really, really sad. So what do pipelines have to do with MMIW or MMIP? Well, they have to do a lot. So in the back-end region between North Dakota and Montana, the number of attacks on Native women in the region increase with when the population of transient oil workers staying at places called man camps goes up. So when oil production goes up and the oil workers come in, assaults and violence against Indigenous women go up, right? That's fact. That's a study out of North Dakota. So during one of the peak production seasons of the camp in 2014, reported sexual assaults increased according to the University of North Dakota. And in this particular region, tribal law enforcement has no jurisdiction over these camps, even though the camps are built on reservation land. And that's the other thing that we should talk about too in terms of jurisdiction is tribes don't actually own their reservations. That is not land that we own. That land is held in trust by the federal government. The deeds to those land are held by the federal government. Why? Because we were deemed not competent enough to handle our own affairs. I wish I was making that up, but I'm not. So what we can do on our reservations is very limited as well. So like, for example, my mother has reservation land. Normally, if you have land, right, and you pass on, you can pass that land down. Not reservation land. That land, when she passes, if my father's still alive, he'll get to live there. But after they're both gone, once both of them are gone, that land reverts back to trust status. They don't get to pass it down to their children. So there's no generational land wealth that's built up. So this is very interesting. So because these camps are on reservation land, but the trust is held by the federal government, the tribe has no jurisdiction over them. So, for example, of the 1 million acres that make up the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota, the tribes only, this went out again. Okay, sorry. The tribes only cover an area of 500,000. And this is how the camps can be on the reservation and the tribes have no will over them. So the government just took away the other half and said, we're going to put these camps on here, you don't get a say over it. And you'll be like, but that's reservation land, that's guaranteed to them. No, it's not. The government can take it whenever they want. Nothing in Indian country is guaranteed. Nothing in Indian country is guaranteed. It's really annoying. So when we are, as Indigenous people, are fighting against things like the Dakota Access Pipeline, like the Keystone Pipeline, we're not only fighting to protect our earth and keep that oil or natural gas or what have you in the ground, we're fighting to protect our Indigenous women, our grandmothers, our aunties, our sisters, our nieces. Many times the camps will only just be built 40 miles away. That's not very far. And that's a significant concern for tribal people. So I want to talk briefly about the Violence Against Women's Act. I'm going to say VAWA from now on because there's so many agencies that deal with Indian country and other things that we all just put them down to a few letters. So Violence Against Women's Act was passed in the 90s, and the first time it was passed, there were no revisions for tribal people at all. None whatsoever. But in the Reauthorization Act in 2013, it allowed for tribes to arrest and prosecute non-Native assailants, but it only limited them to domestic violence. So if you were a non-Native assailant and you came onto a tribal reservation and you committed domestic violence, we could totally arrest you and we could totally prosecute you. But if you committed murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, rape, participated in sex trafficking or child abuse, we couldn't do anything to you. Couldn't do a darn thing to you. Also, in the 2013 Reauthorization Act, the definition of Indian country didn't extend to the 228 of the 229 Alaskan Native tribes. Why is that? Because Alaska has a very unique relationship with how their tribal organizations are set up. So Indian country, the definition of Indian country didn't include them. So then there were those crimes that were committed in Alaska were forwarded to the federal government. And under that, we also had Public Law 280. Now, Public Law, I mentioned earlier. So PL 280 was an act that was enacted in 1953 by Congress, and it would grant certain states jurisdiction over tribal matters. They would handle the load, and tribal issues would filter through civil and state courts. PL 280 does not grant states power over tribes or their lands, and this is only in 6 states. So in Alaska, in California, Minnesota, except the Red Lake Reservation, Nebraska, Oregon, except the Warm Springs Reservation, and Wisconsin with the exception of the Menominee Reservation. From its enactment, PL 280 was opposed by Indian nations due to the one-sided process that imposed state jurisdiction on tribes and the complete failure to recognize tribal sovereignty and tribal self-determination. So it basically was like, tribes were like, you're taking away our ability to self-govern ourselves. So when he signed it into law, President Eisenhower expressed misgivings about the lack of tribal consent and urged an amendment to require a tribal referendum, but no amendment passed Congress until 1968. But I would like to point out, even though he had misgivings about Public Law 280, he still signed it. He still signed it. He still helped take away that tribal sovereignty. So we had in 2022, we had it reauthorized again, VAWA reauthorized again. This time it added some new things to help. So it expanded special criminal jurisdiction of tribal courts to cover non-native perpetrators of sexual assault, child abuse, stalking, sex trafficking, and assaults on tribal law enforcement officers on tribal lands. And it supported the development of a pilot project to enhance access to safety for survivors in Alaskan Native villages. So the things that in 2013, so it said domestic violence, it now added in everything else, right? It also created a missing and murdered Indigenous unit in the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and the Department of the Interior. The VAWA 2022 authorization required that these departments work together. We all know how well federal agencies work together, right? And so really the only department agency that has been doing any sort of work, besides the Department of Justice a little bit, is the Department of the Interior. And I think that's solely because the head of the Department of the Interior is an Indigenous person, right? So they're bringing awareness to this issue. And even though we have the missing and murdered unit, in order to get these crimes investigated, you have to ask. They don't just go out and investigate them. And the missing and murdered Indigenous unit also has the ability to say, this case doesn't have merit, or we don't have enough evidence ever, and we don't think we will, so we're just gonna close it, toss it aside and close it. So there's still issues, right? We have Indigenous people who've been missing for decades, and their families are crying out for help, and we still can't get it. So that is something that I think is really important to mention. In August of 2019, Sarah Stops Pretty Places turned 18. She turned 18, she's an adult, she's a citizen of the Crow and Cheyenne nations. A few days after she turned 18, she went missing. A week or so after she went missing, a jogger was jogging through a very populated area, a very populated intersection, and they found Sarah's body lying in the backyard. Her family wasn't informed for 2 weeks. Her family was not informed for 2 weeks. Because of the condition that the coroner's office said that her body was found in, her family was pressured to go against their Crow and Cheyenne beliefs and have her body cremated. The ball has been dropped from the police starting in the federal government to local to tribal, right? This has been a failing on everybody's part. We have no idea who harmed Kay Sarah. We have no idea who thought it was a good idea to dump her body in the middle of a backyard somewhere. We don't know why the Bighorn County's Sheriff's Department decided to hide the fact that they found her body for 2 weeks from her family. And since then, the family has been trying to figure out what's happened to her. They're trying to find out what happened to Kay Sarah. If you go to justiceforkaysarah.com, you can learn more about her case. You can see upcoming events. You can download flyers. And you can share to your social media. But it's very important that we understand the severity of these cases and understand that sometimes tribal police can play a role as well. So I wanted to spend a moment talking about colonization or decolonization and colonization. So sexual violence and colonization are two issues that we talk about separately, but you can link them together. Sexual violence can be seen as part of the logic for our genocide, and racism can be seen as the process that will ultimately deem a group of people as dirty or unclean or inferior. Light to dark, black to white, good and bad, right? So I want you to think about those. From colonization, native bodies have been seen as unclean, not pure, easy to invade, and easy to toss aside. Columbus writes about that in his journals when he first encounters the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. He talks about how unclean they look, how pagan they are, how the women would be great for them to pass around as men. So he starts that process. Many times, Native women are hypersexualized. When a majority of people in a country think of Native women this way, it's easy to see how they fall prey to violence. So, is everyone familiar with the Disney movie Pocahontas? Right, okay. I remember watching it when I was a kid, and I thought if I talked to a tree, it would talk back. It didn't. But I want you to think about Pocahontas in that movie and think about how she's portrayed. Now remember, we said at the beginning she's 10, okay? Did she look 10 in that movie? Girlfriend did not look 10 in that movie. She looked like a grown adult. Her hair was all wild and undone. She had makeup on. She was very dark complected, beautiful features. She was barefoot. She was wearing a buckskin strapless dress. She was very developed for a girl of 10. Now I want you to think about the movie Beauty and the Beast, and I want you to picture Belle. What does Belle look like? Her hair's done up nicely. She's clothed, covered. Even when she turns into the princess at the end and she's wearing this beautiful dress. She's very light-skinned. So how we're portraying black and brown bodies in media plays a role as to how they are treated in person. So a professor out of Arizona State University started to research the race of perpetrators as well as the use of racial slurs during assaults. Many times the perpetrators express a white supremacist ideology and will blatantly state that they assaulted or murdered a victim because she or he was or is Indigenous. However, many times the crime can be motivated by something else, possible drugs, so proving that it's a hate crime is hard, and then the crime isn't prosecuted as one. Many times, more often than not, Native women are seen as inferior to white people as a class, and then inferior to white women as a subclass. So why are Native women so vulnerable? Throughout the United States and Canada, there are remnants of male dominance from colonization and the treatment of women. The United States has no problem calling out atrocities and human rights violations to every other country in the world, but we don't look inward, and we don't look and see what we have done for human rights violations and atrocities. 70 to 80% of the time, perpetrators of violence are non-Native. However, that leaves 20 to 30% in the hands of Native men, and that is an issue that needs to be addressed. It is not an excuse, but that violent behavior can be linked to colonization. And there are groups and organizations within our Indigenous communities that are taking our Native men and saying, hey, this is not right, let's work on this. It's restorative justice and rehabilitation as opposed to imprisonment, right? We've got to work through this. Let's talk about it. So, but why are Native women so vulnerable? The laws that are put in place on paper broadly protect all women, but they usually don't protect Native women. State and local police, even tribal police, are spread thin in rural areas, and often crimes are not investigated. Responses to violence are non-existent. Resources to investigate crimes are non-existent. And it gives the appearance that crimes committed against Native people are non-punishable. Yeah, you can go onto a reservation, commit a crime, leave, no one's going to do a thing to you. Because we don't have the resources to do the thing, and policy doesn't allow us to. There also isn't an effort put forth stating that once you enter a reservation, you are now under their jurisdiction. When I leave Michigan and I go to class in Wisconsin, I am to follow the laws of the state of Wisconsin. I am to follow the speed limits or suggestions on speed in the state of Wisconsin. Tribal reservations have their own laws and ordinances, and they're not enforced. We're not able to enforce them. So there is this false sense of sovereignty. So I want to quickly just go through some statistics from the Urban Indian Health Institute. This is a study you can find online. I encourage you to find it online. It's not terribly long. It has some really great numbers. Urban Indian Health Institute is based in Seattle. It's headed by Abigail Echohawk. They do really great work. Not only around MMIW, but also around they did a really amazing study on how COVID impacted Indigenous communities. So I want to go over just a few things from you. I'm not going to go over a lot because I do want to leave time for some questions, and I have a tendency to be long-winded. So the National Crime Information Center reported in 2016 that 5,712 Native or missing Native women and girls were reported. Remember that number, 5,712. The U.S. Department of Justice official missing person database only logged 116. Okay? The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, which we have all become intimately more aware of in the past few years, states that the third leading cause of death of American Indian and Alaskan Native women is murder. As an Indigenous woman, the CDC tells me that my third leading cause of death is murder. Murder. Let's see. What else do I want to depress you with? I'm missing a page. This is so not professional. Okay, here we go. The Urban Indian Health Institute was able to identify 506 cases from 71 cities. 128 were missing Indigenous women. 280 were murdered Indigenous women. 98 had an unknown status. The median age of a victim was 29. 66 of the cases identified were tied to sexual or domestic violence. The youngest victim was a baby that was less than a year. The oldest was an elder who was 83. So it just goes to show that it doesn't discriminate against age. The study also identified 153 cases that they referred to as the invisibles because they didn't show up anywhere in any law enforcement records. Nowhere. They showed up absolutely nowhere. The study also looked at geography and saw New Mexico had the highest number of reported cases at 78, followed by Washington State with 71. The urban area with the largest number of cases identified was Seattle at 45. They did send out FOIA requests, which are Freedom of Information Act requests. They surveyed 71 cities, city police departments, and one state agency. 40 of them provided some level of data. 14 provided no data, and at the time that the report cut off, 18 still had pending requests. But they also looked at how Indigenous, these cases are covered in the media. And they found that national media never covered 95% of these cases. When the cases were covered, there was a tone of victim blaming. There was bias in the media referring to reservations as violence-ridden areas, which they are not. Having lived and worked on tribal reservations, they are not. They are places of great community. 38% of the time in articles published, there is a reference to drugs or alcohol usage by the victim, and 4% of the time, there's an excuse made for the perpetrator. They also talked about racial classification or misclassification. many of our federal systems are outdated and need to be updated. So if you don't physically type in on the computer that this person is Indigenous, it automatically defaults to white. Automatically. So we don't have exact numbers, which is really, really awful. Olivia was a 32-year-old mother of 5 who vanished from the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in North Dakota on October 24th, 2017. After Olivia hadn't responded to phone calls for 2 days, her family reported her missing to the authorities, which sparked several widespread searches of the reservation and much of western North Dakota. On July 31st, 2018, Olivia's truck was discovered submerged in a lake on the reservation. Her body was in the passenger seat with the seatbelt still around her. An autopsy was conducted and the cause of death was undetermined. And we still don't know how she ended up in that lake today. So Savannah LaFontaine Graywind was 8 months pregnant when she disappeared in August of 2017. She was taken by her neighbor and murdered, and the baby was taken from her womb. Savannah was only 22 years old. Her perpetrators, though, were brought to justice, and the child was placed in the custody of her biological father and is a flourishing little girl right now. Because of that, we have Savannah's Act, which was introduced in 2017. It's intended to help protect Native women from violence that they experience at a hugely disproportionate rate, as we have discussed. It aims to increase communication between federal, state, tribal, and local authorities and strengthening data collection. The bill was signed into law in October of 2020. We also have the Not Invisible Act, which was signed into law in October of 2020, and it established the Commission on Reducing Violent Crimes Against Indians, and also established the Not Invisible Act Commission, which is a commission that is currently active, that is meeting. It consists of survivors, families, survivor families, federal agencies, and advocates who are working to combat this issue. Policy, many times more often than not, policy is created without women of color in mind, especially Native women. They're often left out of the discussion, even though we suffer higher rates of violence. Policy has to be created with women of color at the center of it, and it has to be taken into consideration that Native women not only deal with physical violence, but also bureaucratic violence from the state. Violence from state politics, as well as violence from within the communities, needs to be addressed at the same time, together, not separately. It doesn't work when you do it separately. The community needs to be involved and heard when it comes to finding solutions for this problem, because who better to help solve the problem? Who knows the community better than the community members? So Cheryl Lynn was last heard from on July 3rd, 1999. She called her mother from an unknown number in Arkansas to let her know she'd come by her house in Oklahoma City to pay back some money that she had borrowed the previous week. She never made it. The week before she vanished, when Cheryl showed up to borrow money, her mother and her sister found her to be in pretty bad shape. Her mother wanted her to go to the hospital, but she refused. She went missing in 1999, and the whereabouts of where she is today is still very much unknown. So this goes to show that it's not just something that's happening now. There's a story of a woman from Wisconsin, I believe she's Menominee. She went missing in the 80s. We still don't know what happened to her. So this is a problem that transcends. So finally, if you want to learn more, I encourage you to listen and watch the first 3, Missing and Murdered, Finding Cleo, Who Killed Alberta Williams, and Stolen, The Search for Jermaine, are podcasts done by the CBC. They're amazing podcasts. In fact, Jermaine's story is very much like Gabby's story, except I bet you didn't know Jermaine's name, but you knew Gabby's name. Say Her Name is a documentary that talks about MMIW. There's another one that I didn't put on here because I forgot about it until just now. But if you have access to Showtime, Murder in Bighorn County is really good. It is a 3-part series. It came out last year. It was at Sundance. It's amazing. You should watch it. It's really sad. And then finally, if you want to watch a more movie dramatized version, I encourage you to watch Wind River. Wind River is an actual reservation in Wyoming. The case in the movie that they follow is not any one particular case, but it does a very good job at showing that's exactly what happens in Indian country when someone goes missing. The frustration of the tribal police, the frustration of the coroner, right? There was frustration on the side of the coroner. There was frustration on the side of the FBI. So there was a lot that that movie covered. So with that, I shared an absolute ton of information with you this evening. And if I forget later, I want to thank you now for coming out, hearing about a really difficult and hard topic, allowing me to talk about this really hard topic, one that affects me personally. I mean, I know where she is now, but there was a brief moment in time where my own sister was missing and struggles with her own issues. So this is a topic that I never really thought would touch me personally, but it does now. And so I thank you for taking the time to come out and hear it. And now that you know it, maybe you can pass that information on to somebody else. So with that, I'm going to take a drink of water. And if you have any questions, do please feel free to ask them. I lecture on so many different things. You can't offend me on anything, so you can ask me anything. If I don't know something, I'm going to say I don't know it. If you think of a question later, send me an email and I'll try to answer it. But again, thank you guys so much for coming out. Thank you to the library. Thank you to the World Affairs Council. And with that, I think we have a few moments for some questions. So thank you guys.
Wherever you are, just raise your hand, and Heather will call on you, and she's just going to try to repeat your question in the microphone so it can be heard by those who are remote. So,
Yes.
Okay. You said you couldn't be offended, so I appreciate that. The narrative I always heard growing up was Indians, alcoholism. You know, everything that's alcoholism, that's the issue, that's why you stay away, blah, blah, blah. Can you give a fair assessment of that?
Yeah, absolutely. That is not.
Heather?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, sorry. The narrative that you've been told about alcoholism in Indigenous communities is a stereotype that has been perpetrated for a really long time. Since the beginning. Are there issues with alcohol within the Indigenous community? 100% there are. There are. Is that an excuse, or is that how we should judge all Indigenous people? Absolutely not. I myself don't drink at all, right? Number one, I don't like the taste. It's not that I didn't, I was, younger than 21 at one point. But it's just not something that I find appealing, I find enjoyable. But I can also understand why the rates of alcoholism within Indian country are high, right? When we think about, I myself, one of my most favorite family members, was a functioning alcoholic for a really long time, and I never knew it. I never knew it until I got older, and I was like, And then I would notice as this person was making their drinks, I'd be like, there's more whiskey than Sprite now as the evening would go on. So it is a problem that obviously affects my family as well, but it doesn't mean that we should be judging or thinking about Indians and Indigenous people in that way, right? There are reasons as to why said alcoholism is high, and that stems to socioeconomic conditions, right? That's just something that happens. That the accessibility of alcohol has also been really easy to get. There are a number of reservations in the United States that are dry, right? But you can't stop it from coming in, right? So Pine Ridge Reservation is a dry reservation. You cannot buy alcohol on the reservation at all. But it borders Nebraska, and it borders other towns where you can find alcohol and bring it in. So we can only control what we can control. There are great programs, substance abuse programs and AA programs on reservations that are helping to fight this issue. But a lot of people whom I've heard stories from that talk about their own issues with alcohol, who have been sober for a number of years, and you ask them why,